Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well Hung History, true crime, true history, and the true tales of the condemned and the executed. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. This episode is called They Asked for It, and it will concentrate on those men and women that have been sentenced to death and have either welcomed their fate or have sought no legal path to delay or prevent their own mortal end. You may be surprised at the prevalence of this seemingly counterintuitive stance. I certainly was. It's thought that about 10% of those condemned in the United States, at least, are in fact execution volunteers. So let's dive deeper and try to better understand more about this and learn along the way some of the more notable cases of those that have sought to hasten their own deaths rather than languish any longer under the rigors and hopelessness of confinement on death row. It's probably best to start with the commonly used legal term for this, and that is execution volunteers. Now, I don't know about you, but for me the term volunteer has a positive connotation that implies charity and altruism. Either that or maybe just a simple citizen of Tennessee that loves their football team. But that is the term, and as we learn more, we'll see that it's aptly applied. Surely this response to being condemned to death is ancient, and there are many known examples of this throughout history, but for the sake of our show today, we'll focus mostly, not entirely, on more contemporary cases that date from the reinstatement of capital punishment in the United States, dating from the Gregg versus Georgia decision in 1976. This followed a 10-year moratorium whereby all capital crimes had been commuted to life imprisonment. The first volunteer in modern-day America was Gary Gilmore in 1977, and for those of a certain age, you may remember him in the famous book and movie of the day called Executioner's Song. His story was told in print by Norman Mailer, and he was posthumously portrayed on screen by Tommy Lee Jones. There was a subsequent film about him called Shot in the Heart, which was released in 2001. Though his crimes and ultimate death are indisputable, his very name is a bit of a mystery. He was actually born Fay Robert Kaufman in rural Texas. His wayward father, it seems, chose this name as he was on the lam from the law and living under an alias. But he was not Kaufman. He was Gary Mark Gilmore, the name his mother intended and bestowed back to him when he was a young child. The family was a deeply troubled one and led a nomadic and criminal existence around the western United States, eventually settling in basic squalor in Portland, Oregon in the 1950s. Despite being considered highly intelligent, even later recording an IQ of 133, he nevertheless left school in the 9th grade and returned to a life of perpetual crime and confinement. Beginning with a particular penchant for auto theft, he soon afterwards turned to armed robbery. He served numerous stints in juvenile detention and state prison throughout his teens and 20s. After being declared an habitual offender, Gilmore was sent from Oregon to the federal pen at Marion, Illinois. And once paroled there, he moved on to Utah, his mother's home state, and it doesn't take long for all hell to break loose. Just a few months after his arrival in the Beehive State, he committed the cold-blooded killings of 2 innocent, unarmed men over 2 nights in both Orem and Provo in July of 1976. It took only a 2-day trial to convict him of murder, and though he made a desperate attempt at an insanity defense, his own legal team actually presented 4 shrinks that all testified to his own sanity. So essentially, as we've seen in this show and other cases, his, quote, defense team was that in name only, and they really acted more as prosecutors against their own client. Resigned to his fate, and despite his mother's failed pleas to save his life, he waived all appeals and made it known that he sought to be executed. His options for this in Utah at the time were hanging or firing squad. He famously chose the latter. Despite his intentions having been made clear, other do-gooders, particularly the ACLU, succeeded in winning several temporary injunctions against the pending execution. His frustration with this mounted, and he said the following, quote, "They always try to get in on the act. I don't think they've ever really done anything effective in their lives. I would like them all, that group of reverends and rabbis from Salt Lake City, to butt out. This is my life and my death." Gilmore's wish was finally granted on the morning of January 17th, 1977. He was strapped to a chair and the traditional black hood was placed on his head. 5 volunteer riflemen, 4 with live rounds, 1 with a blank as was the custom, assembled behind a curtain containing 5 holes from which to fire the volley. His final words were spoken in Latin to the Catholic prison chaplain, "Dominus vobiscum." Translation, "The Lord be with you." And the chaplain replied, "Et cum spirito tuo," in English, "and with your spirit." And though I did take Latin, I struggled with that very badly, so please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Next up, in no particular order, is another Butte, or Brute, really, named James Allen Red Dog. He was of Lakota Sioux Indian extraction and was born on the Fort Peck Reservation in Montana in 1954. He was not a nice guy, and he would go on to murder 5 men in 4 different states, in addition to countless other crimes. No point to go into all the grisly details here, but his killing spree began in Montana in 1973, followed by a double killing in California in 1977. After this, it was Illinois in 1983, and finally Delaware in 1991. Most of his sad and violent life was spent behind bars, and he quite shockingly escaped permanent confinement various times for a variety of reasons. He escaped, walked away from furlough, and after ratting out some other criminals, was entered into the Witness Protection Program and assigned a new identity in Delaware. Red Dog seemed to harbor a death wish throughout his entire life and consistently told other inmates and various authorities and attorneys that due to his Native American beliefs, he wanted no part in being held in captivity and instead chose to be exterminated. He waived all appeals to save his life, and his family made no attempt to save him either. He was adamant that he deserved what was coming. And that day did come in the state prison in Smyrna, Delaware, on March 3rd, 1993. He went down as just the second person executed in that state in 50 years. His final request was that his remains be sent back to the native lands of his birth in Montana, and after some legal wranglings, this request was granted. Next on this long list is Ronald Gene Simmons. Nope, not the old Kiss singer with the makeup and the long tongue, but a serial killer from Arkansas. While the other Gene Simmons was writing and recording really horrible music in the 70s and 80s, this guy was a hunting and a killing his own family members and a few other unfortunates over a roughly 1-week period in 1987. In all, 16 souls died by his hand, ranging in age from 1-year-old to 46 years old. His trial for this was quite quick, and he was sentenced to death, but not before attacking the prosecutor, who rightfully accused him of incest and fathering a child to one of his murdered daughters. Knowing that he almost definitely would be murdered by other prisoners, he said the following, quote, "To those who oppose the death penalty, in my case, anything short of death would be cruel and unusual punishment." In 1990, he was executed by lethal injection at the Cummins unit in Arkansas after the warrant was signed by then-Governor Bill Clinton. I guess it's no surprise that no one claimed his body and he was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. Well, this list goes on, and at the risk of sounding gratuitous, we'll briefly chronicle the circumstances of a few more. Let's revisit the prison cell of Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian-born American anarchist who attempted to assassinate Franklin Delano Roosevelt in Bayfront Park in Miami in 1933. His shots missed the target and instead took the life of Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who was on the stump with the president, and he also wounded other bystanders. We've covered this case briefly on this channel in another episode called Truly Shocking, the history of the electric chair, so check that one out. After being arrested at the scene, he was truly unrepentant and even boastful of his actions. This was no doubt motivated by his fanatical atheist and anarchist views. As Mayor Cermak lay mortally wounded in a Miami hospital bed, Zangara was rapidly tried and found guilty. He was initially sentenced to 80 years, 20 for each of the people he had shot. He barked at the judge in his broken English, and he said, 4 times 20 is 80. Don't be stingy, Judge. Give me 100 years. Well, the math became very swiftly a moot point as Cermak succumbed to his wounds just days after the initial sentence. So now an essential life sentence became a death sentence, and he was shipped up to Florida's Old Sparky at Rayford, and he was known to remark from his death cell the following: "You give me electric chair, I no afraid of that chair. You is one capitalist, a crook man too. Put me in electric chair, I no care." His wishes were granted, and on March 23rd, the electrodes were strapped to his body, and Zangara's final words were, "Viva Italia! Goodbye to all poor people everywhere. Push the button. Go ahead, push the damn button." Several decades later, say hello and goodbye to Marco Allen Chapman, a multiple murderer and rapist executed by the Commonwealth of Kentucky in 2008. He is, as of this recording, the most recent person to suffer this fate in the Bluegrass State. But suffer may be the operative word here, as years on death row had become unbearable to him, and he became convinced that for his heinous crimes, he deserved to pay the ultimate price. He repeatedly told anyone who would listen that he was racked with guilt and remorse, and that his state-administered death was the only rightful way to bring any semblance of peace and closure to the living members of the family that he had slaughtered. Following his arrest, he confessed to his crimes and asked the sheriff to put him out of his misery. He would later tell the court that, quote, "I did something that was wrong and immoral. I want to pay the price for it." He breathed his last breath at the state prison at Eddyville on November 21st, 2008. Let's wrap this one up with someone else that has been alluded to on this channel, and her crimes have made her notorious, and that's the serial killer Aileen Wuornos. Many in the audience will be familiar with Wuornos, as her tragic life was captured by the 2003 feature film Monster, as well as several documentaries and other books. So we'll skip the details of her crimes other than to say she was found guilty and sentenced to numerous death sentences for the murders of 7 men she encountered while working as a prostitute in Florida. She was born into truly unimaginable, horrific circumstances in Michigan in 1956 to teenage parents, where her mother gave birth to Aileen at the age of 16. Her lovely father was soon sentenced to life for rape and kidnapping, and he hanged himself in prison in 1969. Wuornos later confessed that her first experimentation with sex, drugs, and presumably rock and roll had begun by age 11, and she bested her mother by giving birth to a child at age 14, whom she gave up for adoption. She was then kicked out of her grandparents' house, and now homeless at 15, turned to prostitution. I guess it's not so surprising that she turned to crime herself in her teen years and engaged in virtually non-stop criminal behavior that began with petty crimes and then gradually escalated over the years to murder. At 20, she hitchhiked to Florida, where she would spend most of the rest of her miserable life, with occasional trips back to Michigan. She even married a man 50 years her senior. That is for a few weeks, until she battered him almost to death with his own cane. She then spent several years raising a ruckus in South Florida and was arrested several times in Miami and Key West, serving predictable and voluminous jail stints for various and sundry crimes. By 1986, now age 30, she was living a little further north in Daytona Beach, where she met and, according to her own words, quote, fell deeply in love with a 24-year-old motel maid named Tyria Moore at a gay bar in that beach town. This turned out to be a very fateful and ultimately fatal relationship. The two lived together and basically supported themselves through theft, insurance scams, and prostitution. Her hatred of men, and probably humanity in general, took a lethal turn in rapid order over a one-year period beginning in 1989, during which time she murdered at least 7 men, as alluded to earlier. These were all middle-aged Johns, whom she would alternately claim raped her, or sometimes she would claim that she would just simply rob them for their money and their possessions. Well, the jig was up in 1991 when Wuornos and Moore were noticed by a bystander abandoning the car of one of the victims, and Eileen's fingerprints were easily traced to her. The cops went after Moore first, and under duress, she agreed to wear the wire that would eventually implicate her girlfriend. The next year, after offering a rather meek plea of self-defense, Wuornos was tried for the murder of one of the men and sentenced to death. She would then go on to rapidly confess to the others. In all, she was handed 6 death sentences. The body of the 7th man was never found. As her name and crimes had become notorious and life behind bars was unbearable, she constantly claimed that her very existence was threatened by guards and inmates, and that her food was tainted in an attempt to take her life. She waived all further appeals to spare herself and admitted, quote, I killed those men, cold as ice, and I'd do it again. I'm one that seriously hates human life, and I would kill again. Her life of mayhem and misery came to an unremarkable end when she was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison October 9th, 2002. But not before she left us with a final memorable utterance that has been referenced on another episode of this show, and it goes like this. Quote, I would like to just say I am sailing with the rock, and I'll be back, just like Independence Day, with Jesus. Big mothership and all. I'll be back. Aileen? Are you sure about that, Aileen?
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.